journey right now that I need you to survive. My experience at McAfee has been just that, realizing the diversity that I did not have growing up and realizing what it truly can mean to not only me but to the world itself. When Savanda asked me to kind of explain what brought me to writing this essay and brought me to what I'm about to read to you, and it really is just that, putting words to it. I thought about it all night last night and all day today, and I can't. This has really been my heart, but you don't really know that it's your heart until you come to the place where it's needed to come out. And in my journey right now, it's coming out.
All right.
So be with me this morning and pray for me as I read you my heart.
Amen.
I'm pleased to join you today in what may not go down in history at all, but what I hope will be a great demonstration for freedom and unity in the history of McAfee School of Theology. 50 years ago this August, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today spoke the heavy words that a bleeding nation needed to hear. He stood tall and delivered a speech that I draw root from today. This historic speech came as a great beacon of light and hope to millions of African Americans who had been scarred by the flames of withering injustice. But 50 years later, we must face the tragic fact that freedom is still not fully realized in the hearts and lives of Americans today. 50 years later, the life of people living on American soil is still crippled by the shackles of persecution and the chains of discrimination. We may have moved past the signs that read for coloreds only. We may have moved past the outward demonstrations of hate, yet 50 years later we still divided across railroad tracks between churches and even in our classrooms.
Right.
50 years later we refuse to walk across the hall, the road, or the neighborhood because they're just too different than we are. Our president gave a historical speech at the Clinton Global Initiative. He called for major policy changes at home and abroad to combat the enslavement of millions of women, men, and children in modern-day slavery. 50 years later, sex trafficking is still a worldwide cancer that we think can be treated with a dash of ignorance and a dab of indifference.
All right.
50 years later, undocumented immigrants live on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material possessions. 50 years later, we still fail to realize the effect we have had on natives of this land. We bury their memory as deep as we can, barely remembering them until we pull out our team's favorite t-shirt or hat.
Come on.
And yell, "Go Braves. How about them Indians or those Chiefs sure look good this year." 50 years later, a woman's wages is still significantly lower than that of a man's. 50 years later, we still run people out of their workplaces, our worship centers, and refuse them their rights simply because of the person they choose to love.
Come on, Ron.
People who have been deemed too different in our culture are still suffering in the corners of American society and find themselves in exile in their own land. Now, my friends, freedom has changed us into exactly what we hate. So we come here today to expose these appalling conditions. The groups of persecuted and marginalized Americans have come to lawmakers and elected officials time after time to cash a check of sorts. When the architects of this nation wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to adhere. This note was to promise that all men and women would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens who are undocumented, homosexual, or just deemed different are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given these people a bad check that has come back insufficient funds.
Jesus.
But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come here today to stand for and with these people as they cash this check. A check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed place to remind Christians of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the sedative drug of apathy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of persecution